John Carpenter's The Thing, read by Whispering Storyteller. Introduction. A spacecraft shattered the vacuum of space, its light spinning and glowing in the darkness, as it plunged towards Earth and began to burn in its atmosphere. Chapter 1. The Dog. Antarctica, winter, 1982. It was a desolate yet beautiful place. The jagged snow-topped cliffs protruded from an untouched snow like sharp, broken teeth, eager to tear apart anything that crossed their path. A helicopter appeared above the ridge, its rotor blades shattering the icy silence. Below, a husky dog ran through the deep snow. It looked back. As the chopper approached and swooped lower, the rotors almost screaming for it to stop. The dog turned and ran, almost losing its footing. A thick-set, heavy-bearded man wrapped in a parka leaned out of the helicopter. He aimed an automatic rifle at the exhausted animal. He fired once, twice, missed. The dog changed course and the helicopter swooped past. More gunshots, all more desperate than the last. The dog pounded across the vast, empty plateau. It was running for its life. United States National Science Institute, Station 4. An array of mismatched buildings broke the horizon, all connected by various passageways. They were barely visible beneath the thick snow. A smattering of vehicles and a helicopter were parked outside. Inside, a group of men were relaxing in the rec room, unaware of the helicopter approaching their camp. R.J. McCready, a helicopter pilot and a functioning alcoholic, sat alone in his shack playing computer chess. He was a long-haired, bearded loner. He didn't like people that much, and he certainly didn't like to lose. He sipped his Jim Beam Scotch whiskey and stared intensely at the screen, concentrating. He tapped his move into the keyboard, looking overly pleased with himself. The computer made her move. Mac looked smug. "Poor baby, you're starting to lose it, aren't you?" he muttered under his whiskey breath. He tapped his next move. The computer announced her next move. Smugness gradually turned to anger as Mac realized he was beaten. "Checkmate," announced the sexy computer-generated voice. Mac opened the panel on the front of the computer and poured the remains of his whiskey inside, blowing its circuits. Cheating bitch. Yeah, Mac certainly didn't like to lose. The sound of the helicopter dragged McCready from his shack. The cold air nipped at his face, and he watched with cynical mistrust as the chopper circled the camp. He sipped from the bottle of whiskey still in his hand. It warmed his throat, but nothing else. Giles was outside now too, curious to what the helicopter was up to. Giles was a big man and a hothead. 6'2", 450 pounds. You don't mess with Giles. Palmer, Norris and Bennings joined him, pulling on their coats. Palmer was the second-string chopper pilot and Child's roommate. He was a hardened stoner. That was the only reason Childs put up with this spaced-out nonsense. The guy always had some good weed. Norris was a nondescript geophysicist. He never offended anyone, ever. In fact, most of the team forgot he was even there most of the time, which is something he actually didn't mind. Bennings was a balding meteorologist, bursting with nervous energy, like he was everyone's favourite uncle, mild-mannered and unassuming. They were all wondering who was in the chopper, and they muttered amongst themselves. "It says Norwich on the side," Charles announced. "It's Norwegian," Norris confirmed forever the group SWAT. As the helicopter touched down in the distance, the rest of the group drew on their jackets and joined the others outside. Well, all except Gary. Gary was the station manager, ex-forces, regimented. He never went anywhere without his trusty revolver attached to his hip. He watched cautiously from inside. The exhausted dog ran to the group of Americans and jumped at Bennings, licking his face. The two Norwegians leapt from the helicopter. The pilot pulled back his arm to throw a grenade. It slipped from his grasp, landing in the deep snow. The man carrying the rifle screamed and ran. The pilot scrambled around frantically on all fours, trying to find the grenade. Boom. The pilot and the helicopter were blown to smithereens. The remaining Norwegian raised his rifle and screamed at the Americans in his native tongue. They all stood and stared, dumbfounded, not understanding a single word. The Norwegian aimed his rifle and fired. The bullet struck Bennings in the thigh, and he collapsed to the ground. The other men dove for cover. The Norwegian charged after the dog that fled away toward the station to cower terrified of the commotion. Gary smashed the window with his revolver and took careful aim. Blam! The bullet shattered the Norwegian's skull, and he fell back, twitching in the snow. The men scrambled into action, grabbing extinguishers and dousing the flames of the burning helicopter in case it caused any further damage. The dog watched from a distance. It seemed relaxed now, content almost. Clark meandered out of the camp. He was the station's dog handler. Clark was a big man with very little to say. He loved the solitary existence of the Antarctica. He loved the company of the animals. Dogs were loyal. Humans were not. He petted the dog as he watched his colleagues gather around the smouldering wreckage. "The first goddamn week of winter," Mac muttered beneath his icy breath. Inside, Bennings flinched as the stitches pulled his torn flesh together. Dr. Copper, a balding older man with a nose ring in a mischievous bedside manner, teased his petulant patient. They wondered why the Norwegians had gone berserk shooting at a dog. The doctor suggested cabin fever. The cold and the isolation can make people do crazy things. Windows sat at the communications room wearing his headphones and signature sunglasses. He hated his job, he hated the cold, and he wore his sunglasses to remind him of the California sun. US number 31, calling Mercado, over. His tone was urgent. Nothing, not even static. Dead silence. Blair, the no-nonsense senior biologist, stands over windows. He looked agitated. His thick moustache twitched as he chewed the side of his cheek. Blair told him to reach someone, anyone. They needed to report this mess. Windows lost it. He screamed at Blair, informing him he wasn't able to reach anyone for 2 weeks. Blair stared at Windows, unimpressed. Stalemate. The rest of the group were gathered in the rec room. They placed a sheet over the dead Norwegian, his eye missing where Gary shot him, and they discussed their next move. Dr. Copper was in favour of flying over to the Norwegian camp to see if he could see them and identify what caused the men to go berserk. Station manager Gary wasn't convinced. He thought the journey was too dangerous in this weather. It would take an hour to get there and an hour to get back. Palmer leapt from his chair and volunteered to fly them. By the smell and the look in his wide eyes, they knew he was as high as the snow-topped mountains that towered over the camp. Naturally, they declined. A short time later, station manager Gary and Dr. Copper shuffled through the snow towards McCready. Gary yelled at him to get his gear as he was given the task to pilot the copter to the camp. Mac looked up to the sky. A storm was brewing and he didn't look happy. Dr. Copper could sense the tension between the two alpha males. He looked at Mac, telling him he didn't have to fly if he thought it was unsafe. Mac softened. "You really want to save those crazy Swedes, huh?" "Norwegians," Dr. Copper corrected. As the helicopter lifted up to the steely grey sky, the dog padded softly through the maze of cramped, empty corridors that connected the many rooms within the compound. Inside, the bitter winds howled around the building. It stopped at one of the dormitory doors. The shadow of a man could be seen inside. He turned his head as the dog entered. Chapter 2. The Norwegian Camp. The helicopter flew low above the icy vista. Mac and Copper could see the burnt-out remains of the Norwegian camp up ahead. Smoke drifted ominously into the clear white sky. It didn't look good. It didn't look good at all. As the chopper touched down, Mac climbed out, carrying a shotgun. Dr. Copper didn't bring a weapon. He was a little more trusting of people, but Mac trusted no one. Well, there was one guy he trusted from his days in Nam, and that was a fellow helicopter pilot named Tate, but he hadn't seen him in years. Maybe he'd look him up when he got out of this frozen hellhole. The two men investigated the burnt-out yet frozen remnants of the camp that lay open to the elements. It was completely devoid of life. Nothing but the eerie wind that whistled up and down its empty, labyrinthine corridors. There were signs of something terrible occurring there. The rooms were trashed. Windows were smashed. Barricades lay piled up against doors. A bloodied axe was buried in a door. Frosted blood trails covered the icy floor. Dr. Copper yelled for Mac. He'd found something. There was a man sitting in a chair. He was frozen stiff, his hair covered in icicles. Dr. Copper shone his torch onto the cadaver. Frozen blood glistened in the light, hanging from the man's slashed wrists. The beam continued, lighting up a cut-throat razor in his icy death grip. Dr. Copper guided his torch up to the man's head. His mouth was open in a silent scream. His throat had been slashed too, almost severing the head from its body. "Oh my God," Copper whispered. "What the hell has happened here?" "Come on, Doc," was all that Mac could offer as he readied his shotgun and continued their search through the dark, frozen, empty rooms. Mac stumbled upon a portable video unit. Copper was excited. He gathered up the machine and what could be important paperwork. If only they could read it. It was all in Norwegian. Mac continued to check the last few rooms alone, creeping along the crumbling corridors, his breath drifting off into darkness in wisps. As Dr. Copper gathered up the crumpled sheets of notes, he heard Mac's voice. He'd found something. The doctor felt a wave of anxiety. He didn't like Mac's tone. He followed the voice into another room where Mac stood wielding his torch. There in front of them was a gigantic block of ice with a huge hollowed center. It looked like something had once been housed within it and possibly thawed out. Mac glanced to the wall, seeing a photograph taped there. He leaned closer to view it. It showed a party of 5 Norwegians, arm in arm, toasting each other. They were huddled around a large block of ice. Something dark and opaque lay inside of it, encased within. Neither Mac or Dr. Copper could find a single word to say to one another. The whole place felt wrong. The frozen snapshots of carnage made even more eerie in the silence. Both men wanted desperately to get out of the place, but neither admitted it to one another. Moments later, armed with the portable Norwegian video unit, they walked outside to return to the helicopter. Dr. Copper finally broke his silence. "Look, maybe they found some fossil or some animal buried in the ice and they chopped it up," he muttered. "Then where is it?" retorted Mac. Something nearby caught their eye. It was as if every moment seemed to reveal something more horrific than the last. There was a pile of smouldering mess was the only way to describe it. Neither could make out any detail of what it was. Some of it resembled charred human limbs, and some of it, well, they just didn't know. Discarded canisters of kerosene lay nearby. Whatever it was, it had been destroyed and burned in a hurry. Much to their relief, they decided to leave it. They must get back. It will be dark soon. Chapter 3. The Thing in the Tarpaulin. The men spoke little during the return. In the back seat, a piece of tarpaulin containing the charred remains of the thing they'd found outside lay on the floor. Dr. Copper had insisted they take it back. He was intrigued and wanted to conduct an examination. Mac hadn't been enthused, but dutifully followed the doc's orders. He could smell that strange stench that emanated from inside the tarpaulin. It was a mixture of burning, combined with a putrid acidic odor that made him feel nauseous. In just over an hour, the helicopter descended down over their camp. In the growing darkness, the warm lights of the compound below provided some comfort to Mac, a welcome return to some kind of normality. For now. Inside, the dog watched silently through the snow-flecked window as the helicopter landed and the huddled figures of Childs, Norris and Clark ran over, assisting Dr. Copper and Mac to carry the tarpaulin inside. When they reached Dr. Copper's room, they laid the tarpaulin on the examination table and then exposed what lay beneath it to the horrified party. Incredulous, the men stared at one another, trying to make sense of what lay on the slab. It appeared to be the corpse of a man, badly charred. What was left of the trousers and shoes of the bottom torso were ripped and split, as if his legs and feet had just burst from the inside. The man's upper body was almost undecipherable, gnarled mess of protoplasmic mush. The head was strangely disfigured and melted. It was situated not on his shoulders, but near the abdomen. Tendon-like appendages were wrapped around the carcass and sticking up and out in odd postures. Station Manager Gary, normally composed and decisive, was simply lost for words. It was Dr. Copper who broke the silence. "Blair," he muttered, "I would like you to start an autopsy right away." A short time later, Gary, feeling stressed, strode into the communications room and found Windows lying asleep at his post wearing headphones. Gary turned up the volume, prompting Windows to spring to consciousness in a fright. "Have you reached anybody yet?" asked Gary with authority. "No, we're 1,000 miles from anyone and it's going to get worse before it gets any better," retorted Windows. "Well, stick to it, Windows, stick to it," ordered Gary, leaving the room in a fluster. In the medical examination room, Dr. Copper had already completed the autopsy of the dead Norwegian, and it drew a blank. There was no evidence of drugs, alcohol. There was nothing out the ordinary that had caused the man to go berserk. Blair turned to the charred man-thing that lay on his table, which was certainly anything but ordinary. He made a large incision into its stomach and placed his gloved hands inside and pulled out gooey entrails. Blair examined them closely. "Well, what we seem to have here appears to be a normal set of internal organs: lungs, kidneys, liver, and intestines." Chapter 4. Put that mutt with the others. As the night descended, the lights of the compound shone brightly. In Palmer and Child's shared quarters, a grainy game show played on the VCR. Stranded in deepest Antarctica, the pile of videocassettes were all they brought with them and was their only source of entertainment. Palmer grimaced. "I know how this one ends," he muttered, ejecting the tape and hastily loading in another. He lay back in his bunk, lighting a freshly rolled spliff that he had acquired from his secret room down in the icy basement. With the aid of a handful of sun lamps, he was successfully harvesting an endless stash of cannabis plants. At that same moment, the hazy rec room was alive with chatter as the men played snooker and cards. Giles jumped as the dog brushed past his legs beneath the table. "Clark," he shouted, "will you put this mutt with the others where it belongs?" Clark, playing pool, looked over and nodded. He'd forgot about the dog. Moments later, Clark led the dog toward the underground kennel. It followed silently, without any issue. He reached the large cage area that housed the pack and unlocked the door. Inside, it was cramped with the other dogs that lay sleeping in a pack. Clark glanced at the dog that seemed unsure whether to enter. "Go ahead," he prompted. "What are you waiting for?" The new dog walked slowly in, and sat down in the middle of the cage. Clark watched for a moment, then moved away, eager to return to his game of snooker upstairs. As he left, he switched off the light. As his footsteps faded, the new dog remained in the middle of the cage, unnaturally still. The howling wind screamed against the walls outside. Just then, a strange, soft purring sound emanated from within the new dog. The sound grew louder. The other dogs were now awake and clearly uncomfortable. They bared their teeth and barked, backing off with fear. The new dog was still as a statue until its face peeled back like a banana, revealing a grotesque, huge tongue-like thing that protruded from the gory mess. The new dog was now unrecognizable, as strange, thin, light tentacles appeared from its fur and wrapped out across the kennel. The terrified dogs tried to dodge it, chewing helplessly at the wire door, desperate for an escape. With a disgusting squelch, 8 hairy legs sprouted outwards, and the dog thing started scuttling like a spider, violently spurting a liquid substance. Clark reappeared, having heard the unearthly commotion, and walked down the corridor towards the whine of the terrified dogs. A silence fell as he tried the light switch, but the bulb inside had been smashed. He took out his flashlight and opened the kennel door, colliding with a couple of dogs that fled past him and down the corridor. He heard the strange rattling sound from the creature and saw the quivering tentacles reaching toward the door. He pushed it closed with his foot, trapping the creature inside. He rose to his feet and pushed the bolt along. Upstairs, Mac opened the fridge door looking for a drink. As he held the drink in his hand, he then heard the unearthly commotion downstairs in the kennels, a hideous mix of screaming, barking and howling. He didn't like the sound of it at all, so he immediately sounded the fire alarm to alert everyone. Within minutes, Mac, Gary and a few others reached the scene holding rifles. It was there they saw Clark standing terrified. "I don't know what's in there," muttered Clark, "but it's weird and it's pissed off, whatever it is." Upstairs, all the men, half-dressed and confused, were now gathering in the communal corridor, wondering what the hell was going on. Giles was instructed by Mac to grab a flamethrower and bring it down. Mac led the team as they edged closer, the rifle raised. Nearby, the screams of the creature grew louder. On the other side, Blair and a few others appeared, the kennel in between both parties. Mac instructed them to stay back. Mac stepped forward and shone his flashlight into the area. He saw a wriggling, gory mess quivering on the floor. Its distorted body didn't look like a dog, yet a canine-like face angled up toward Mac and bared its teeth. It didn't look right. It was hairless. It looked like it was morphine. The men watched behind the wire wall of the compound, not believing what they could see. Nearby, red, gory tentacles wrapped around the writhing dog like spaghetti, as if choking the life out of it. Mac couldn't take it anymore. He opened fire, shooting at everything. The men joined in, opening fire with their weapons. Clark couldn't stand watching Mac shoot his beloved companions, so he barged in and tried to grab the rifle from Mac. The men started a panicked scuffle, and Mac managed to shut the kennel door again, keeping the terrifying creature inside. The dog thing's stomach opened up, and 2 gooey, glistening humanoid arms rose up in the air with bunched fists. It opened its hands, revealing 3 clawed fingers. The arms protruded into the ceiling and broke through above, Within seconds, it hoisted its disgusting, writhing body up and out of sight. As Giles appeared holding the flamethrower, Mac opened the cage, instructing him to burn it. Giles entered, seeing a pulsing mess of flesh and fur. It was another creature, and it split open, where a strange fleshy digit poked out, opening like an umbrella. "Torch it!" Max screamed, this time with anger. Giles pulled the trigger and the whole kennel was alight with flames. The creature screamed as it burned, falling motionlessly down on the floor. A few minutes later, the men entered, spraying fire extinguishers to contain the fire that could easily spread. They all stood silently at the smoking mess. There was no words that anyone could offer. Chapter 5. The Autopsy. Some time afterwards, a bleak daylight broke out. The outpost stood silent against the desolate landscape. Inside, in the medical room, Blair had all the charred remains of the creature on the autopsy table. The men watched from the open door, craning their necks, wanting to hear some answers to the questions they all had. The thing on the table was a mangled mess of legs, teeth, and tentacles. Blair started by snapping off one of the huge, spider-like legs. He took a scalpel and made a deep incision and then poked his hands inside, cursing as he fished around, peeling back the skin and flesh to reveal a huge, distorted face that looked half dog and half human. He was speechless. Whatever this thing was, it definitely wasn't like anything anyone had ever seen before. A few hours later, he had something to offer the men. "Look, what we have here is something that can imitate other life forms, and when it imitates them perfectly." Mac, Gary, and the men could only stare. This was incredulous. Blair circled around the hideous thing that still lay on the table. "When this thing attacked our dogs, it tried to digest them, absorb them, and in the process shape its own cells to imitate them. We got to it before it had time to finish." Later, Clark soothed one of the traumatized surviving dogs as Blair administered a sedation. He asked Clark if he'd noticed anything strange about the dog before he'd placed it in the kennel. Clark shook his head. Blair probed further. What was it doing in the rec room? Clark didn't know. He mentioned it had been wandering around the compound for a while. Blair shook his head. "You mean to say that dog hadn't been put in the kennel till last night?" Clark nodded. "And how long were you alone with that dog?" Blair continued, staring at Clark coldly. Clark informed that it had been an hour and a half, maybe. He felt uncomfortable. He didn't like the way Blair was staring at him and challenged him back. "It's nothing," offered Blair. "Probably nothing at all." Chapter 6. The Wreckage in the Ice. Later, Blair, still silent and troubled, stood as the crew reviewed the Norwegian footage they had found. They had been trawling the videotapes for hours, and so far it had mostly been endless silent movie footage of the men working, playing soccer in the ice, and goofing around. But then things had become a lot more interesting. The men had filmed themselves finding something buried under the ice. It seemed as though it had been a location 5 miles northeast of their camp. The group then circled around the object, extending their hands to gauge its huge size. The next scenes showed them planting thermite charges, and moments later, there were some big explosions. Whilst Mac got dressed, he felt deeply troubled. They had located the area on the map that the Norwegians had detonated in the ice, and they were leaving to investigate it further. A while later, Mac flew the helicopter over the sparse wilderness. The silence was broken by Palmer pointing down, yelling, "There, 1/2 mile due east." Ahead of them was a huge cavernous circular crater in the ice. It was clearly man-made and caused by the recent explosion. Mac lowered the copter down close to it and shut off the engines. Mac, Dr. Copper and Palmer climbed out and gazed over the edge of the crater and gasped. It was like nothing they had ever seen before. Jutting out of the ice was the wreck of some metallic object, a craft of some description. The men could only gawk, intimidated at its sheer size. Moments later, they were abseiling down it, feeling a rising mixture of fear and excitement in their bellies. What the hell was this thing they had found? Was it alien? Soon, they were walking on the craft itself. It felt smooth, unlike any metal they'd ever experienced. There was a hatch open. They gazed down inside of it. "How long do you figure this has been in the ice?" asked Mac. "I think the ice that far down is about 100,000 years old at least," answered Dr. Copper, feeling excited. "And those Norwegians blew it up," said Mac, gazing at the carnage. Nearby, there was something else that was strange. A block had been cut out of the ice. Its shape was a perfect square, the shape that matched the thawed ice block they'd found in the Norwegian camp. Chapter 7. Blairs' Research. A few hours later, back at base, the dusk gathered for another long, dark night. Inside, the men gathered in the rec room once again, trying to make some sense of the bizarre situation they found themselves in. "So, a few 100,000 years ago, it crashes and this thing gets blown out. It crawls out, then freezes on the ice," mumbled Mac, swigging from his bottle of Jim Beam as if it were water. "I just don't believe any of this voodoo bullshit," grumbled Childs, sucking on a fat cigar, feeling more nervous than he was actually letting on. "Do you believe this voodoo bullshit, Blair?" asked Childs, edging closer to the biologist, who had been quiet for some time. Blair remained silent and pensive as Palmer answered for him, mumbling about governments secretly knowing things that was dropping out the sky all the time. Over by the pool table, the men examined the strange pieces of metal that had been taken from the debris site. They could make no sense of it. It was like a substance they had never seen or felt before. Gary attempted to take control and summarize the situation, concluding that the Norwegians had dug something up out of the ice. Mac finished his sentence, adding that whatever it was had thawed out. Suddenly, the sound of roller skates broke the silence as the cook, Knowles, wheeled in the doorway of the room, oblivious to their deep conversation. He flung a dirty garment on the table. "Which one of you disrespectful men tossed his dirty drawers in the kitchen trash can, huh?" he barked, eyeballing each man in return. "From now on, I want my kitchen clean, you hear?" He rolled off again, still muttering under his breath. Mac picked up the dirty garment. Giles hadn't even acknowledged the cook and continued on his tirade of questions. He asked Mac, "But how does this thing wake up after thousands of years in the ice, and how can it look like a dog?" "Because it's different from us, and it's from outer space. I don't know, Ask him, snapped Mac, pointing to Blair, who still silently studied photographs from the Norwegian camp. So, do you buy any of this voodoo bullshit, Blair? Asked Giles, now grown impatient. Blair finally looked up at the men, but remained silent, for he had no answers to offer. Sometime later, a grim-faced Blairs sat alone in his lab, poring over a grainy monitor screen that showed a pixelated unknown intruder cell assimilating that of a dog. He couldn't understand how this strange organism had imitated the dog. What were the other strange shapes he'd seen on the thing during the autopsy? Were there other life forms it had imitated? His other thoughts were further fueled by the next software diagnostic report. It read, probability that one or more team members may be infected by the intruder organism, 75%. That troubled him. That troubled him a lot. He leaned forward and typed into the program and awaited its response. It came after a few moments. Projection. If intruder organism reaches civilized areas, entire world population infected 27 hours from first contact. Blair shook his head, a deep unease racing through his body. He reached into his drawer and took out a revolver. He was taking no chances. He was convinced at least one of the men must be infected. Chapter 8. The Chameleon Strikes in the Dark. In another room, Mac sat drinking his second bottle of Jim Beam. The warm buzz it gave calmed his nerves somewhat. He still had the dirty garment from Noel's kitchen trash can in his hand, and he continued to inspect it. It looked as though it had been shredded. Dr. Copper interrupted the silence on the intercom. Mac, I'm removing that thing out of the lab and into the storeroom. Can you come and get your stuff? I'll be there in a minute, Doc, answered Mac, still poring over the garment for one more moment before getting up, leaving his bottle there for his return. As he approached the storeroom, Dennings and Windows were placing the creature's remains that were wrapped in a white sheet on the storeroom table. Mac removed his pilot's belongings. Dr. Copper had ordered for the remains to be locked away from everyone. One of the other men, Fuchs, approached Mac as he walked out of the room. I have to talk to you, Mac, he whispered. It's important. Mac was tired. What is it? He groaned, wanting nothing more than just go back to his room and drink the remainder of his Jim Beam. Outside, in the snowmobile, said Fuchs, aware that Norris and Palmer were listening. Mac sighed. It was 40 below out there, but Fuchs was insisting, so followed him out of the storeroom, leaving the two men behind. Windows couldn't resist pulling the white sheet away from the creature, exposing that hideous humanoid face that was twisted in half. We need to burn this thing, Windows said, feeling disgusted to his stomach. You can't burn the find of the century, replied Bennings. That's going to win someone the Nobel Prize. Windows pulled the sheet back over, concealing the hideous thing. As he walked away to assist Bennings to get whatever items they needed before they locked the storeroom up, he didn't notice that the thing under the blanket was now moving. Windows left the storeroom looking for the keys to unlock the storeroom. Gary, the station manager, had them. He left Bennings alone in the room. As Bennings, now alone, searched the shelves for items, a disgusting trail of dripping gloop fell down on the floor from the table. Bennings didn't hear a thing. Outside, a silent dark night had now fell upon the camp, as Mac and Fuchs sat in the snowmobile facing each other. There's something wrong with Blair. He's locked himself in his room and he won't answer the door, said Fuchs. I took one of his notebooks from the lab. Listen to this. Fuchs pulled the book out of his bag and opened it. Mac sat in exhausted silence, waiting for the man to continue. It could have imitated a life form on millions of planets, he read in a shaky voice. It could change into any one of those things at any time, and now it wants life forms on Earth. It's getting cold in here, Fuchs, and I haven't slept in 2 days, said Mac numbly, only half listening. Wait a minute, Mac, Fuchs pressed before resuming his place in Blairs' notebook. It needs to be alone in close proximity with a life form to be absorbed. The chameleon strikes in the dark. So is Blair cracking up or what? Interjected Mac. He was irritable and fighting sleep. It appears when there is still cellular activity in these remains, continued Fuchs, ignoring Mac and now racing through the woods. They're not dead yet, he concluded. He looked from the book into Mac's red, puffy eyes and waited for a response. It didn't come. At the same time, Windows returned to the storeroom holding the keys from Gary. He stopped in mid-sentence at the sight before him. There was carnage in the room. Torn clothes, gore and entrails. Something slithered in the corner of the room. Windows turned to slowly face it. A blood-soaked Bennings lay in the corner, wrapped in a tangle of creeping tentacles that slithered around him. One had even entered his open mouth. The man was dead. There was no doubt about it. Windows muttered under his breath and fled. Back in the snowmobile, Mac and Fuchs still sat in silence. I'll go get the doc, Mac whispered, feeling the creeping fear surging, pulling him from his tiredness. I'll get Gary and we'll meet in Blair's room, he concluded. As Mac and Fuchs left the snowmobile, they almost collided with Windows. It's Bennings, he muttered in terror. They all ran back to the base to investigate. Inside, they entered the storeroom and found it empty. Windows stared wide-eyed. Bennings was there, right there. I swear it, Mac. It had a hold of him. There was a broken window. Mac ran over to it and peered out, seeing the silhouette of Bennings running away clumsily, almost like a drunkard. Within seconds, the alarm broke the silence across the base, and Mac and some of the men fled outside on the trail of Bennings. As they gave chase, Bennings collapsed to the snow. As the group circled around him, Mac ordered them to stay away and keep clear as Bennings remained hunched down on his knees in silence. This isn't Bennings, shouted Mac, lighting a flare in his hand. Now all of the men poured out into the freezing snow and gathered around as the Bennings thing stared ahead, unblinking. There was something wrong with its hands. They were huge and spider-like. The Bennings thing opened his mouth and a guttural scream emerged. It was terrifying, unlike anything any of them had ever heard before. With a mixture of terror and disgust, Mac pushed over a barrel of paraffin that leaked around the Bennings thing and threw down the flare. It went up in flames, howling in pain, yet it remained kneeling in position, unmoving. Moments later, Mac was back inside the storeroom grabbing a flamethrower. Oh my God, what's happening to him? Said a trembling voice. It was Gary. He looked bewildered. If it had time to finish, it would have looked and sounded just like Bennings, said Mac. Gary stared back confused. It was one of those things out there trying to imitate him, Gary, said Mac. Gary was speechless. But I've known Bennings. I've known him for 10 years. He's my friend, Mac. He's my friend, was all he could push from his trembling lips. We've got to burn the rest of him, said Mac. There was no time for sentiment. Outside, the men doused the remains of Bennins with paraffin, encasing it with piles of snow from the mobile. Mac then instructed the men to step back as he released a jet of flames that sent Bennins into a fiery incinerator. "Is that all of the remains?" asked Mac. "We've cleaned out the storeroom, the lab. There's nothing left," said Knowles. "Where's Blair?" asked Gary, noticing he was missing. The men looked at each other as they watched the plumes of smoke drift up into the still night air. Chapter 9. Blair's Outburst. Later, Mac buried the charred remains as the snow returned. He looked up as Fuchs came out to speak to him. He told him he couldn't find Blair. "Where are the other men?" asked Mac. "Windows is in the radio room trying to get through. Everyone else is in the rec room." "You go back in, and I'll be there in a minute," said Mac. Fuchs did without another word. As Mac picked up the flamethrower, he saw a silhouette darting across the outside area. It was Blair. He seemed to be running away from the helicopter. Mac shouted, but Blair ignored him even though he clearly heard. Mac watched him enter the compound. Mac approached the helicopter. The plastic sheeting that covered it danced in the breeze. He poked his head inside and was shocked to find the inside control panel had been destroyed. It was a mess of tangled wires that had been ripped out. What had Blair done? It was their only transport out. Mac fled in the compound after Blair, running down the corridors. He eventually heard shouting somewhere ahead. As he approached, he glimpsed Gary and some of the other men ducking behind boxes by the radio room. Mac dived behind a corner as he saw Blair with his revolver poised. Blair fired blindly, telling everyone to stay away from him. A bullet embedded in the wall inches from Mac. "He smashed up some of the chopper pretty good," Mac informed Gary. Somewhere nearby, Blair screamed at them all, "Keep away from me." He was crazed. A madman. Mac snapped his head towards Childs, who was crouching nearby. "Go and see if you can get to the tractor and stop him before he gets there." Childs nodded and sneaked away without a word. He seemed happy to get away from the mayhem. "Nobody gets out of here," screamed Blair, addressing everyone. He was now brandishing an axe and started hacking at the communications unit. Sparks flew as the axe tore into the machinery of the radio room. He mumbled incoherently as he carried on his rampage. In the corner, a bloodied Windows cowered, feeling helpless and terrified. There was footsteps. Charles returned and flopped against Mac. "He's already destroyed the tractor too. He's also destroyed the rest of the dogs." Dog handler Clark heard that last bit and stood numbly with his mouth open. Without a word, he fled up the corridor toward the kennels before anybody could stop him. "Childs, go and try and talk to Blair from the other room," ordered Mac. As Childs obeyed this second order, the men were planning their move that involved a folded table. Inside the radio room, Blair was still going berserk, and there wasn't much left to destroy. "If that thing wanted to be an animal, no dog makes it 1,000 miles to the coast," he shouted to no one in particular. Charles appeared in the other doorway to the radio room, trying to reason with Blair. "Come on, Blair. You don't want to hurt anyone," he offered in a gentle, reassuring tone. Blair responded by shooting at Childs. Childs dived around the corner, the bullets missing him by inches. "I'll kill you," said Blair. He was wide-eyed and sweating. His gun suddenly went dead. Its empty barrel clicked endlessly. In sheer anger and frustration, he flung the spent revolver at Childs, whilst Mac, Gary and Knowles dived in the room, brandishing the flat table. Blair turned and swung the axe. It embedded in the table, its blade narrowly missing Mac on the other side. Mac pushed Blair against the wall, but the crazed man was strong. He pushed back and Mac fell to the floor. Blair also attacked Gary and sent him to the floor. Blair picked up a chair and swung it in the air. It crashed through a window. The men all dove on him as Mac administered one swift punch that knocked Blair out cold. Meanwhile, in the kennels, Clark stood staring at the carnage. His tear-streaked eyes darted at the lifeless corpse of his beloved dogs. He was crushed and couldn't believe it. The men dragged the limp, unconscious Blair outside. It was now daylight, but the stark whiteout offered no comfort. They took him inside the tool shed. Inside, Blair was now sullen and awake. "Why am I here?" he mumbled to Dr. Copper, who administered a sedative. "For your own protection, Blair," quipped Copper, trying to curb his anger at what the man had done. They all left the tool shed. All except Mac. "How you doing, old boy?" Mac asked, unscrewing the fresh bottle of Jim Beam. "I just don't know who to trust," said Blair in a whisper. "I don't know what you mean, Blair," said Mac. "Trust is a tough thing to come by these days. Why don't you just trust in the Lord?" he said, leaving the bottle on the table and heading to the doorway. "Watch Clark," offered Blair coldly. "Watch him close, do you hear me?" Mac left the tool shed, locking the door behind him.